You know what the problem with shovelware games? As it turns out, it's actually got worse. Way, way worse. And today's story basically started off because loads of us, me included, maybe you, went to Steam Next Fest, and early on in the most recent Next Fest, we kind of saw it was a heap of slop, and that was really quite worrying. And look, for many of us, there's the fear of missing out. And that can come in bad ways from publishers, but it can also be quite genuine. The idea that if there is a torrent of slop games on Steam, that you will miss out on good games because they'll just be buried. It is becoming a problem, and the thing is, Steam actually knows about it. The sort of hidden angle to today's whole story is what Steam is actually doing and how the publishing of games actually works. But to set the tone, almost 19,000 games released on Steam in 2024. That number keeps going up, and by the time of the most recent Next Fest, things really began to feel different. So many slop games, lots of just weird AI stuff. And Aftermath posted this. It's got a good headline. Steam users worry good Next Fest games are being crowded out by AI slop. That's basically my experience of the start of this Next Fest. But it's a long headline, and it ends with, the real problem is more complicated. And that's not just a tease to go and read the article. I mean, maybe it is that, but no, it's because it is actually more complicated. It's more complicated because Valve are doing something about it. And if Next Fest felt awful to you early on, it's because you were kind of part of an experiment. I've also got a truly novel experience to share. It's Boot Dev who have sponsored today's video. You see, there you can learn the coding, engineering, and career skills to break into back-end web development. It's like an average salary of 100 grand, work from home, and a lot of really sick stuff, but with quite the twist because their founder is a massive gamer, and that's why Boot is different. It's an RPG. Quests, levels, XP, boss battles, real-time leaderboards, and an active Discord community, almost, I guess, like having your programmer MMO guild. It's really cool. And when you're learning a new skill, that kind of thing matters. And the skills you'll be learning are back-end web development using Python and Go across a wealth of content that cover the fundamentals and even deeper learning topics like really getting into algorithms, which, by the way, is real fun. You'll build projects for your portfolio, and you'll dodge two massive problems. One, tutorial hell, where you just bounce from place to place randomly in the internet without a cohesive path. And two, get rich quick style bootcamp hell, because Boot is actually realistic. It's got the sauce. You can see that through their UI, their vibes, how they've structured everything, and they're just plain better than the rest. And you can find that out for yourself with 25% off your first purchase at boot.dev/Bellular News. It's no risk. You can browse their content, do demos, and a lot more for free. And when you do buy, it's a 30-day money-back guarantee. To sort out what the hell was going on, Aftermath spoke to Simon Carlis. He's one of our go-to analysts as well. He runs a great newsletter. Now, they, and probably you, noticed this heap of slop early on in Next Fest. Awful-looking AI-generated banner and capsule art, loads of shovelware games, and just vibes that made Steam feel real cheap. I mean, if you love PC gaming and you do it in Steam, but you go to Steam and you just see lots of shit, that's just not going to feel good. But before long, it actually stopped to feel like that. We began to see less of the slop. And Simon frames it as a classic experiment. At the start, when you don't have data, you spread out impressions more evenly. And by you, I mean Steam here, right? And then, as you get that data, like click-through rates, download rates, demo playtime, and so on, you then begin to dole out those impressions based on performance, right? So basically, it's finding product market fit. That's essentially what the Steam algorithm does, by the way. It doesn't take long for Steam users' activity to basically discover near non-existent product market fit games because they're slop, they're shit, nobody wants them, so they've got awful click-through rates, people don't download the demos, and they delete the demos. That shows Valve that they should not show that game anymore because Valve wants you to download games, to play games, to buy games, so showing you slop is against their interests. That's basically the point. Valve's algorithm is there to sort the wheat from the chaff. So to do that sorting, it needs to show you both. Now their intent is to do that to show you the wheat so that you're happy. But what happened at Next Fest is that for so many, the chaff scared them off. That's because first impressions count. That's why people were spooked. Hell, SteamDB went and made an AI filter, and Steam users are quite obviously wanting Valve to make an official AI filter. I guess people will do it with tags perhaps, but you get the point. If you open Steam and see loads of slop, you will actually worry for the future of PC gaming, because Steam basically is PC gaming right now. And you then think, how is a store raking in billions let torrents of slop just be thrown at customers? Well, if you're a YouTube user, which you probably are because you're here, you're probably aware already. And if you ask Valve about this, they'll actually have a clear answer. We all know Valve loves systems and numbers, so I'll start this segment on their terms. 1.7 million new customers bought a top 2023 game, they played 141 million hours of other games, spent $73 million in premium games, and $20 million on microtransactions. That was a lot of stats. The source is Valve, and that data is what we call a cohort analysis. It's when you grab a group of users, based on whatever your criteria are, usually a time period, and then you see what those users went and did. And Valve highlighted this cohort for a very clear reason. The thrust of their 2024 year in review was that Steam is not just a store, that Steam attracts and retains customers who will then go on to purchase more games. That's why the selection criteria for that cohort is new customers who bought a top game. It's essentially Valve saying that for their economy, the whole trickle-down thing really does work. It works at scale, and it works because their algorithm makes it happen. And that's also how they justify their 30%, which makes sense. Yes, you can put your game on the Epic Game Store, and you can only have Tim Sweeney take 12%, but you're going to get no sales, basically. Steam does in fact drive so many customers that Epic may as well not exist, at least in terms of it being a traffic source. And to ram that home, Valve say the new game revenue is up 10x over 2014 and that it's up massively over 2023. Now they then get a bit more granular in their numbers, and that's where today's video will really kick into gear. They say over 500 games made over 250 grand in their first 30 days, and more than 200 hit 1 million within that same time span, and that those numbers, people hitting those two milestones of 250k and 1 million, are up by 27 and 15% over 2023, which does look like bloody good news. More games are succeeding than ever, but there's another way to read that, and that is that, well, even per those stats, only 3% of games hit 250k within 30 days, which to many is fucking depressing. But in a way, it's also not true. So now it's time for something that honestly blew my mind when I first learned about it. And I have to start with a confession. I kind of knowingly pulled a fast one on you, so the 19,000 number that I opened with is a true number, but it's misleading. That's basically the point. So get this, 79% of games released in Steam may as well not count toward that number. This is where it gets real fascinating, because that 19,000 is eye-grabbing. It's a really good headline. But what about the 79%? It sounds wild, but it's not. And actually, credit to Kotaku for pointing this out in January. As it turns out, 79% of games are what's called limited. This means that they don't have trading cards, badges, and can't have achievements displayed on player profiles, and they won't until Steam says they achieve, quote, broad player engagement and some commercial success. Now, these games can still be sold to people, they can be recommended to people, but Steam basically does not acknowledge them otherwise. Here's where it gets interesting. We've got some analysis from Bill Young, who's the head of games at Twitch. So he found that of the 18,992 games that launched in 2024, 14,951 are still limited on Steam. And we're actually seeing that as the number of game launches increases, the portion of limited games is also increasing. That 79% is up from 2019's 66% number. Now, I know that I have just absolutely barraged you with stats, and I'm sorry, I know it can be hard to follow and kind of annoying, but they are all going towards somewhere. And our first order lesson of those numbers is basically this. Our feeling of worry, disgust, and FOMO during Next Fest is actually fair, because it is a real problem that we are seeing. But Valve already thought about it, because the algorithm already deals with it. Next Fest, in fact, had so much new that for a very brief period, we had a glimpse into the true hell of raw, unfiltered Steam. But before long, the store algorithm learned, and the slop was filtered out. And to understand this, let's hit some of those numbers again. Valve count new release revenue as anything within 30 days of release. So what we can do is we can take a look at the week starting February 18th, okay? SteamDB says that 385 games were released that week. 385 is obviously a lot of games. That comes out to 55 games a day. Some are slop, some are adult, some are clearly student projects, but most fell into Steam's limited category. Now, can you imagine falling into that category, right? I mean, that slop is filtered out by that category is really good. What about false positives? What if you fall into that? Well, if the Steam algorithm feeds us a tailored personal reality, then what are we missing? Actually, this gets to some things that are fucking scary. So, to work it all out, dug a bit deeper. As customers, we've got a fear of missing out on a great game, and as devs, well, we're afraid of being wrongly limited. So let's work the problem by breaking our sample week down a bit more. Of the 385 games, 20 were premium games with over 1,000 followers, which we know because we highlighted them in our members' newsletter, which will be linked below. Anyway, there's a mix of AA, AAA, indies, a whole bunch, and excepting King of Fighters getting completely wrecked over networking, which I suppose is pretty typical for a fighting game, all of those games have at least a 75% user rating. In fact, half are above 90. Yes, half are above 90. That seems absolutely insane and amazing until you think about it. Steam's job is to show you things that you will like. So assuming it's got enough games to work with and enough people to match those games too, Steam will identify winners and grow them. Ish. Because there's a little more to this. Diving into those games, only 6 have got over 1,000 reviews. 3 of those are AAA games. Most have only got 300 to 600 reviews, and that is a problem. The reason why is fairly simple. The general belief is that the revenue that corresponds to about 400 to 500 reviews is what will typically pay a full year wage for an American solo developer. Making that in a month is absolutely awesome, by the way, but we're talking about the most successful games within our sample. And remember, our sample is a selection of the most successful games. That's kinda grim. And when you look at most of the other games, even within our very successful sample, you see that most have not increased their review count much at all over the last few days. And in a way, that's actually by design. Now, I could give you some anecdotes based from, our time releasing The Pale Beyond on Steam, but Chris Zukowski has a lot more experience than I do and a lot more perspective. Aftermath talked to him, and here's how he explained what's going on here. Steam's release process begins by giving a relatively equal number of impressions to just about any game that does not fall into the Gen AI slop bucket. This happens for the first 2 or so days. And in this period, many Steam users can see a game. If Steam thinks the game is particularly well targeted to you, it'll actually show it to you somewhere. And to get even more exposure and even more data for the algorithm, Steam will feed that game through the discovery queue. Now, what then happens next is what makes or breaks studios. If your game sells well from those initial impressions, Steam will give you more visibility. If you do not sell well, you will stay firmly in your niche. Now, you will get the odd algorithmic sale here or there, but by and large, it will be on you to sell your game. And if this happens to you, the Steam store will feel a lot more like the Epic Game Store, because you're just kind of in sad algorithm land, because as far as Steam knows, when it shows people your game, they don't decide to buy it. And to be clear, in this period, the thing that matters the most is actually revenue. Steam tracks loads of statistics, but revenue is king. Now, Chris is not talking about bad games staying in their niche, though that absolutely is the case. That does happen with bad games. What he's talking about here, though, is gross revenue, and he has a number. For him, the number is 250K, right? 250K seems to be one of the real thresholds where if you cross it, you will start to be shown far more broadly. And funny enough, that 250K actually matches Valve's use of 250K that we talked about earlier from their 2024 year in review. So, most games need to break 250K revenue in Steam to see major long-term success. Long-term success generally is possible, but not major long-term success. So with that in mind, we'll go back to our cohort of 20 games. Of them, 6 hit the 250k mark, 14 did not. And that's even though these 20 had ratings over 75% and half of them had ratings over 90%. Most of our 14, again that's the games in this cohort who did not make 250 or more, well, they are making between 10k and 35k. Which is not a lot of money if you are supporting jobs. And remember that this 20 is not a representative sample of the 385 games that launched in that week. It's the best 20. So yeah, this is even with selection bias cutting in our favor. Now, those cases that I talked about are net revenue, not gross, but you will often hear gross revenue numbers be talked about for games. And when you do, there's something really important you need to know. A very common rule of thumb is that you will see about 50% of the gross revenue that is reported on your Steam dashboard. Basically, 30% goes to Valve, then you've got refunds, taxes, payment processing, just other stuff. And if you had a publisher, well, depending on your publishing terms, you may see 30% of that 55% until you've paid back recoup. Some devs actually see no money at all until they've hit recoup, or maybe even hit double their recoup, because some publishing deals in this industry are absolutely vicious. Anyway, so far this does look rather doomer, doesn't it? But in a way it's not, in a way it's competition. So what I'm now going to do is flip the script. To make this hit, let's pretend we're devs and we're talking shop. So is the solution to say that Steam is bad and you should not release in Steam? Obviously no, it's not. Yes, there is Slop, and that Slop is worrying, but what I've covered in this video shows how Steam systemically quashes Slop as soon as it is identified. If there's a problem, then I think the problem is basically this: it is launch day importance. You live or you die by your launch window. And in some ways that can feel bad. In a sense, it is Valve's fault. But fault is maybe too loaded a term. Launch is the time that a game should be judged. That's fair, that makes sense. And Steam's got a bit of a problem. It can only get data on a game's performance when the game is out there generating data, i.e. when it's launched. And it's less that you are destined for success until Steam murders you, and it's more that if you perform well on your own merits, Valve will then expand your reach until new cohorts of users begin to stop buying as much, and that's pretty much as far as the algorithm will push you. It's on you to make a fun game that is visually appealing with a broad enough audience and a well-selected price point that releases at a good level of quality. For the best shot, what you have to do is nail that, have a quality launch, and cluster all your marketing efforts onto day one, with priority number 1 being 50 reviews ASAP. That tends to be the general advice. That does mean that we'll fix it later attitude is obviously not acceptable, because that will hurt you. And in a way you could say this is us jumping through Valve's hoops, but let's again frame shift. Because it would be lovely if Steam just fed you impressions for longer, but think about it from Steam's perspective. There's a torrent of new games absolutely all the bloody time. And that's not even counting the store space taken up by events, by sales, DLC, and everything else. So what's it going to do? How is it going to dole up its impressions? There's always going to be a balance there, so there'll naturally have to be some sort of limit around your launch. Now, what I've just said is essentially how we should act when we think about Steam. But that's not necessarily because everything's perfect. That's how we should act to get good results. There is a deeper concern, and it's what actually spooks me. Steam can only act based on your past behavior. That means that by default it will pigeonhole you. And that means it can actually make it hard to find truly new games. Because on Steam, on YouTube, on everything, you live in a personalized reality. A developer may have a totally new game that you would fucking love, that you would 100% buy if given the chance, but Steam just literally cannot show you because it's only able to follow your past actions. In a way, it's kind of not Steam's fault. It's a natural problem that emerges from all of this being algorithmically driven. Yet, it being algorithmically driven is what saves us from the torrents of slop. It's what made the later days of Steam Next Fest actually feel really good versus the earlier days when the algorithm did not have data. And it is how Valve justifies, rightly in many ways, their 30% cut, because their algorithm and their traffic does generate sales. It makes successes. It is absolutely awesome to watch Valve problem solve and come up with ways to just deal with the slop problem, but doing it all with systems and algorithms comes at the deeper cost of personalized reality. That makes change hard. That can make innovation hard. It can mean that if you want to make a game, you need to make that game based on what you know does well on Steam, because Steam operates everything based on the data that it has. And if we only follow lagging indicators, how can we be truly new and creative? How can we discover truly new things? These are the problems of our modern world. You see them in YouTube, you see them in news, and here we see them in Steam. Both in the good that they drive, the innovation that they do actually help, the games that only exist and get funded because Steam can basically get you shitloads of sales without a marketing department. But it is at a cost you will feel and reckon with, because as this is happening, we've also got the crumbling of physical games and rising hardware prices. Those are going to precipitate quite a lot of change in our industry, and you can learn about that in our next report.